All right. So today, Polly, Anna, Garrett, and I are going to be discussing COVID-19 and the inequity of higher education access. So the topic that we chose to focus on is how COVID-19 is compounding the degree of already existing inequity in higher education access, and we're aiming to create policy solutions that can be used to mitigate these effects. So first, I'm going to provide some background information on some of the factors that can increase the economic cost of attending college for low-income students. So the main categories set to influence low-income student enrollment are affordability, access to technology, and academic preparation. Affordability can be broken out into college tuition and student debt. Simply put, low-income students face higher opportunity costs if they're considering going to college rather than working right after graduating high school. In addition to this, the threat of graduating with insurmountable student debt is going to be more of a deterrent to these low-income students than it would be to students hailing from higher income families. And in line with this, we know that on average, your lifetime earnings will double if you go from having just a high school education to having a two or 4 year degree. But low-income students do not have the luxury of waiting years for an investment to pay off. Regarding their access to technology, low-income students have less access to things like laptops, the funding needed for textbooks, and cars for transportation to and from their schools. So the cost of the necessary technology in addition to the tuition is a clear example of the way the economic costs of college begin to deter low-income students from enrolling. And then lastly, economic preparation. The majority of low-income students do not receive adequate college prep during high school, and this results in students testing poorly on the already biased college placement test, or they're left feeling as if they wouldn't succeed in a college setting. Academic preparation also refers to lack of advisors and counselors who could have provided necessary one-on-one time and information needed for these low-income students to apply for scholarships and FAFSA that could have potentially lowered their opportunity cost of going to college. Here, these graphs are depicting college enrollment stats as they vary among SES and ethnicity. So as expected, you can see that the students in the lowest quartile of SES are attaining the least amount of college degrees, and those in the highest quartile of attaining the most. And then when you examine the pie chart, the majority of the undergrad population is white. So it's possible that COVID-19 is compounding the already existing disparities in higher education by creating new barriers and making the pre-existing ones even harder to overcome. The rest of our presentation is going to focus on how these numbers could be impacted and what policy solutions can be created to mitigate these effects. And now I'm going to hand it over to Polly to discuss the change in demand for higher education as it pertains to COVID-19.
Thanks, Jalen. So she's absolutely right. There's been a range of impacts on higher education due to COVID. So due to the pandemic and its related challenges, overall demand for higher education has decreased. If you take the market as higher education, this graph shows how demand has shifted left at the market level. Individual firms, schools, have had varying experiences, which I'll discuss in a bit. Data shows that the shift left is smaller among consumers already predisposed and able to pay more for college, which is reflected in the top left portion of the graph. At left is one example, but many higher education experts say that this reaction is different from previous economic downturns. The biggest economic factor affecting demand is the changed opportunity cost of higher education. Inside Higher Ed found that 23% of already enrolled students reported having increased family care responsibilities because of COVID. So now part of your decision to go to school involves, in addition, the cost or availability or safety of childcare or a caretaker for an older relative. If you're still currently employed, your next best alternative to education might be harder to give up now. And most importantly, the financial cost. Your own financial resources could be lower, or your family's, or your fear of taking on debt might have increased because of COVID. We've seen this play out with demonstrably lower numbers of students enrolling or staying in college, with clear differences in students from disadvantaged or underrepresented backgrounds. As I mentioned, the change in demand has not been the same for all institutions. At the market level, there's been a decrease, but this is primarily driven by lower demand for community colleges, which are also traditionally vital education resources for groups that are underrepresented in higher education. Meanwhile, some elite universities have experienced either no change or an increase in demand. But it's important to note, as highlighted by the professor here, that this is likely an indication of the resources that those firms have and the types of consumers they recruit and cater to. And now I'll hand it over to Garrett.
Thanks, Polly. COVID-19 in this pandemic has tested educators and their preparedness to support digital education. And due to the pandemic, most instruction has been shifted online utilizing platforms like Zoom or Teams. And as a result of this shift, almost 1 in 5 educators are reporting a need for additional training in the use of video communication technology. So with this shift to online education, we can observe several clear principal-agent problems. In this context, there's an incomplete contract between the instructors, the agents, and the institutions they work for, those being the principals. A majority of these instructors were presumably hired to teach in-person courses. The expectation that the university instructors now switch instruction methods was probably not included in their original contracts. That contracts are never complete, and it would not be cost effective for the principals, in this case, higher education institutions, to anticipate every possible thing that might occur like this pandemic. So it's likely that many of these contracts will need to be renegotiated during this time to account for changing instruction methods. And we can also observe a second principal and agent problem between the instructors and their students. Students attending university or other higher educational institutions are expecting a quality of instruction. And if instructors are unsure about their abilities with Zoom or Teams, they cannot deliver an expected quality of instruction. And this hidden action can have impacts on a lot of other contracts. And to wrap it up, I will pass it to Anna.
Thanks, Garrett. To increase accessibility and equity in higher ed admissions and operating processes, one policy solution is government financial intervention with equity measures attached. College campuses have faced large costs during the pandemic. They have had to invest heavily in health and safety measures, and they have lost tuition due to student deferrals or unenrollment. Resource dependence from higher education institutions can have two effects on accessibility. It can either encourage accessibility by prompting colleges and universities to accept more students and thereby become less selective. However, higher education analysts predict it is more likely to prompt colleges towards accepting students who can pay without assistance. This move would make higher education less accessible. Offering subsidies from the federal government to colleges and universities who institute equity measures would offset the resource dependence and financial stress caused by COVID-19, with the intent of also offsetting the above tendency towards becoming more selective. The economic explanation around the impact of a subsidy with equity mandates here is in its effect on the college's budget constraint. In addition to mandating specific equity measures, a subsidy would intend to do two things. It would provide an economic incentive to shift the preferences that a college or university holds in favor of equity and accessibility, perhaps shifting the combination of goods and services covered by its budget constraint towards those that are more accessible and equitable. Second, it would reduce the constraints upon the college in this constrained choice model so that colleges are more free to accept students who cannot fully pay for college. In conclusion, COVID-19 has exacerbated existing inequalities in access to higher education, and it will require financial investments on multiple levels to address.